In that night when they came for her, Eleonora already knew her name was not her own. She sat by the frostbitten window, her pale fingers resting lightly on the wooden frame, head tilted as if listening to music that no one else could hear. Outside, the wind moaned through the hills of Briar Hollow, carrying the scent of wet moss, burnt sage, and something faintly metallic, like blood soaked into old stone. Morin, the woman who raised her, paced the room like a cornered wolf. Her breath came sharp, and her long gray hair clung to her face. "He's come," Morin whispered, eyes darting toward the door. "The seal is broken. The blood calls." Eleonora didn't flinch. Her voice was quiet, but something ancient stirred beneath it. "I dreamed of him last night. But he wore your face, Morin. And he was crying." The older woman froze. For a moment, it seemed as though all the air had been sucked from the room. "You were never meant to remember," she said. "You were never meant to return." A carriage wheel groaned outside. The sound struck Eleonora like a bell. The weight of fate. The moment the stars tilt in the sky and never go back. The knock on the door came, not loud, but deliberate, like the closing of a crypt. Eleonora rose slowly. Her eyes, pale and sightless, shimmered as if holding stars behind them. Her white dress clung to her like mist, and she moved with eerie grace, barefoot across the wooden floorboards. "Let them in," she said. "I am ready." Morin hesitated, then obeyed. The door creaked open. And there he was. Lord Tristan Montrevalt. Dressed in black velvet, silver sigil on his chest, a serpent curled around a bleeding rose. His skin was pale as paper, his hair black as crow's wings, and his eyes, empty, like two glass lakes frozen in time. "Eleonora," he said, his voice like velvet over iron. "Your family awaits you. The manor remembers." Behind him, the forest seemed to lean forward, listening. Eleonora stepped out into the cold night. Somewhere far off, a clock struck 13. The door closed behind her. The journey to the capital took 2 days and 2 nights. Eleonora sat silently across from Lord Tristan in the velvet-lined carriage. She could feel his gaze like a weight pressing against her skin, not cruel, but cold, dissecting, as if he were trying to read the story etched in her bones. She didn't speak. Instead, she listened, to the rhythm of the horses, the grinding of the wheels, the whisper of wind through the trees that flanked the road like silent watchers. And somewhere beneath all that, voices. Faint. Fragmented. "She is the one. Eyes like the moon. Death follows the bloodline." She said nothing. If Tristan heard them too, he gave no sign. On the dawn of the 3rd day, the carriage climbed a narrow pass. The air turned sharper, colder. The wind carried the scent of iron and sea. And then, Eleonora felt it. The manor. She couldn't see it, but her breath caught in her throat. The space around them shifted, grew denser. Like stepping into the memory of something that had never truly been alive. Tristan leaned forward, his voice soft. Almost reverent. "Welcome home." The carriage stopped. Hands guided Eleonora out. Her shoes crunched against gravel. The scent of salt and old stone struck her senses. Wind pulled at her dress like fingers. She reached out, and touched cold, carved marble. 2 massive doors opened with a long, agonizing groan. Inside, silence. But not peace. The manor didn't feel abandoned. It felt aware. Every creak, every breath of air, every change in temperature whispered of secrets. Her footsteps echoed like they belonged to someone else. Somewhere above, a door slammed by itself. Then she heard it. A heartbeat. Not hers. Not Tristan's. It was coming from the walls. They led her to a room at the end of the east wing, a chamber with no windows, lit only by candelabras dripping black wax. A bed dressed in crimson. A wardrobe with claw marks on the doors. A mirror, shattered and glued back together. And a painting above the fireplace. She felt it more than saw it, a portrait of a girl in white. Hair like hers. Face like hers. The nameplate read. Lady Eleonora Montrevalt, born 1193, vanished 1200. She froze. Her voice was barely a whisper. That's me. Tristan's voice came from the doorway. Still soft. Still cold. No. That was her. You are, what remains. Eleonora turned toward him, heart pounding. What do you mean? But he was already gone. And behind her, in the mirror, her reflection smiled back without her. The road grew narrower as the carriage climbed into the hills. Trees bent low over the path like they were listening. The fog thickened, curling through the windows like ghost breath. Eleonora tilted her head slightly. They're speaking again, she said. Tristan didn't look up. Who? The ones who live in the trees. A pause. And what are they saying? She smiled faintly. That you shouldn't have brought me back. That was the first time his expression cracked. The horses snorted as if startled, and for a moment, Eleonora felt something, a hand, invisible, brushing her cheek. Cold. Familiar. She didn't flinch. Instead, she whispered, Is the chapel still standing? Tristan's jaw tightened. You remember the chapel? I remember the scent of lilies, and fire. He said nothing after that. What did she mean, fire? What does she remember, and what is she pretending not to? They reached the cliff just as dusk bled into night. Eleonora stepped out of the carriage with eerie grace, her bare feet sinking into the gravel. A chill ran down her spine that had nothing to do with the wind. The manor loomed ahead, a fortress carved into stone, with jagged spires that clawed the sky. It didn't look like it was built. It looked like it had grown. As if the earth itself had given birth to it out of grief. Two servants in mourning black opened the front doors. Neither spoke. Neither breathed loudly. She passed between them, crossing the threshold. And felt something enter her. Not a spirit. A memory. A child's voice, echoing from nowhere. Come find me. Tristan placed a hand on her shoulder, gently, but it felt like a chain. The house remembers you. Eleonora whispered, I remember it too. They gave her a room in the east wing, once sealed, now reopened just for her. She traced the walls with her fingers. Velvet. Dust. The remnants of long-forgotten perfume. A chandelier above, still hung with blackened crystals. The bed creaked when she sat. And then she felt it again, eyes. Watching. Waiting. She turned toward the fireplace. Above it hung a painting. She couldn't see it, but she knew. Eleonora, she murmured. The girl in the portrait had once worn her face. Had once had her name. But now she, Eleonora who was not Eleonora, lived in the shell of that girl's death. The mirror across the room hummed faintly. She stood and approached it, drawn. Her fingers touched cool glass, and for a moment, she saw herself. Except, not quite. The girl in the mirror wore the same dress. But her head tilted in the opposite direction. And her lips were moving. You're not me, the reflection mouthed. Eleonora backed away. Who was in the mirror? A ghost? A memory? Or something that never died? Later that evening, they summoned her to dine. The hall was cavernous, lit by low chandeliers that burned with blue fire. Long tables stretched under paintings of grim ancestors. The faces on the walls all seemed to be turned toward her. She sat across from Edric Montrevalt. Her future. He was quiet, pale, eyes heavy-lidded with secrets. You don't eat? She asked, breaking the silence. I prefer to listen, he replied. To what? To the house. And to you. Eleonora tilted her head. You're afraid of me. Edric didn't deny it. After a pause, he leaned closer. You smell like smoke. So do you. He looked down at his plate, untouched. I dreamt of you once, he said. Before you arrived. You stood in the gardens. But your eyes were on fire. Eleonora's lips parted. I don't dream. But I remember you, in one. Are their dreams shared? Prophetic? Whose memory are they both seeing? Before they could speak again, the candles flickered violently. And down the hall, a door slammed. Hard. Eleonora turned toward the sound. No footsteps. No voices. Just silence. But she knew one thing. The house had woken up. She did not sleep that night. Eleonora lay still on the velvet-draped bed, her hands crossed over her chest like a figure carved in stone. The air in the room was heavy with the scent of burnt wax and dried roses. The candles had long since died out, and yet she could feel the mirror glowing faintly behind her, like a second moon. Something was in it. She could feel its presence the way one feels heat, or hate. Eventually, she rose. Bare feet touched the cold floor. Step by step, she moved toward the mirror, arms out, breath tight. And as she reached it, she whispered. Who are you? The silence that followed wasn't empty, it was listening. And then, just faintly, a voice from deep inside the glass. I am what you were, before the fire. Eleonora's stomach twisted. Before what fire? But the mirror said nothing more. Only her own reflection stood there now, but not quite mimicking her. Its hands were curled into fists. The next morning, she met him. Lord Edric Montrevalt. The heir. Her intended. He entered the grand dining hall like a ghost reluctantly drawn back into the world. Tall, sickly pale, dressed in black and wine red, with a limp he didn't try to hide. His eyes were like storm clouds about to break. You're not what I expected, he said. You neither, Eleonora replied. It broke the cold between them, a crack, small and jagged. He sat beside her. They didn't speak again for a while, but their silence was different from the one she'd shared with Tristan. Edric's was wounded. After breakfast, he led her through the gardens, if they could still be called that. The statues were crumbling. The roses had withered into thorny skeletons. A fountain stood dry, its basin cracked and echoing. They told me you were blind, Edric said suddenly. I am. Then how do you know where we are? Eleonora tilted her head. She could feel the fountain's ache, the rot in the roots, the shadow that pooled beneath the statues. I listen. Everything speaks, if you're quiet enough. He looked at her for a long moment, then said softly. I think you used to live here. Something inside her snapped. A memory, brief, sharp. A girl running down this path. Laughter. White ribbons. A scream. A man in a mask of ash. She swayed. Edric caught her before she fell. You remembered, didn't you? She nodded. And he whispered. Then they'll come for you soon. They always do, once the truth begins to return. That night, the manor didn't whisper. It sighed. Eleonora lay still beneath heavy covers, the ceiling above her alive with silence. Not peace, silence with weight. The kind that presses on the chest and won't let you breathe deeply. She felt it before she heard it, a creaking under the floorboards. Step. Pause. Step. Someone walking beneath her room. But she was on the ground floor. She sat up. The sound vanished. Then, a voice. Faint. Like breath caught in the wind. She still remembers. You cannot hide her forever. Eleonora froze. Her heart beat wildly, but not in fear. In recognition. She stood, moved barefoot toward the mirror across the room. The air grew colder with every step. The girl in the glass was waiting for her. Only this time, she wasn't smiling. She was weeping. Morning came gray and brittle. The sun never fully broke through the mist. A servant led Eleonora to the library. The room smelled of mildew, old vellum, and something floral, lilies, long since dead. Edric was already there. He stood by a stained glass window, the colored light cutting sharp angles across his face. He looked like a statue of sorrow. "I want to show you something," he said, and handed her a book. The cover was scorched. Torn. The family sigil, the serpent and rose, half melted into the leather. Eleonora opened it. The pages were warped with water and time. But some names remained. One circled in faded red ink, Eleonora Montrevalt. Born 1193. Vanished 1200. And next to it, scribbled hastily in another hand. One survived. One replaced. Her fingers trembled. I don't remember this. You weren't supposed to. Eleonora's voice was barely audible. Who am I? Edric's expression broke. I think you're the one they left behind. The one they needed to forget. What would it feel like to learn your identity was built on the bones of another? What would you do with that truth? Later, guided by instinct more than reason, Eleonora found herself wandering the western corridor, the one they warned her not to enter. She touched the wallpaper. It flaked like dead skin. One door stood slightly open. The scent of scorched fabric and iron blood lingered like memory. Inside, a nursery. A child's dress folded on a chair. A cracked porcelain doll staring at the ceiling. And on the wall, scratched with trembling hands. I didn't mean to take her place. Eleonora backed away, then turned. Behind her, a mirror. But no reflection. Just shadow. Until the shadow smiled. That evening, Edric came to her chamber. He looked pale, hands shaking slightly. In them, a necklace. A pendant shaped like a rose, its petals blackened. I found it, he said. In the old chapel ruins. I think it was yours. From before. She took it. And the moment her fingers closed around it, a memory surged. Running through the garden in a white dress. Laughter. A woman's voice calling, warm and distant. Then, smoke. Screaming. Hands dragging her away. She gasped. Dropped the pendant. Edric caught her. Held her tightly. I don't know what they did to you, he whispered. But I don't think you're cursed. She looked up, voice hoarse. Then why does this house call me ghost? He had no answer. Outside, lightning cracked across the sky. And down the hall, a mirror shattered. That night, she woke to silence so complete it felt wrong. The manor had fallen asleep. It was the first time since her arrival that the house wasn't whispering, creaking, sighing through its bones. And in that stillness, she heard something else. A music box. Delicate, haunting. The tune crawled down the hall like a memory set to melody. Drawn by something beyond will, Eleonora rose from bed and followed it, barefoot, nightgown trailing behind her like a ghost's veil. She passed doors she hadn't seen before. One opened as she neared. Inside, a nursery. Dust choked the air. Toys lay rotting in corners. A child's rocking horse creaked slowly, though no wind stirred. The music box sat on a cracked vanity, still playing. She reached for it. And froze. On the mirror above it, scrawled in something dark and dried, were 5 words. You died in this room. Her breath hitched. Behind her, a soft voice. Eleonora. She turned. Edric stood in the doorway, eyes wide, face pale. You shouldn't be in here, he whispered. This wing was sealed after the fire. She turned the music box over. Beneath it, carved into the wood. age 7. She looked up. My name has always been Eleonora. Edric didn't answer. Hasn't it? He stepped into the room, his voice trembling. Your real name is Elise. She staggered back. The walls tilted. That's not possible. I've always been Eleonora. No, his voice cracked. Eleonora Montrevalt died in the fire. You were her cousin, orphaned, found outside the manor in the ashes. You were half blind, delirious, and the family needed a living heir to fulfill the prophecy. She stared at him. Felt her skin crawl. They gave me her name, she said slowly. They made me her. He nodded. Shame written across his face. Elise, not Eleonora, turned back toward the mirror. And the girl in the reflection was smiling again. But this time, her eyes were bleeding. She didn't speak for a long time after Edric left. She sat in the dust-filled nursery, her fingers on the cracked wood of the music box, her breath shallow. Elise. That name felt foreign on her tongue, like trying to wear a stranger's skin. But her soul, something inside her flinched with recognition. All this time, she'd been living inside someone else's death. Later, Edric returned, but not alone. Tristan stood beside him. His coat wet from the sea wind, his eyes dark and unreadable. You remember now, Tristan said, like it was a sentence. I remember enough, Elise replied. He stepped forward. You were never meant to remember. Her spine straightened. Then why bring me here? Tristan's lips twitched, the shadow of a smile or something uglier. Because prophecy doesn't care for truth. Only fulfillment. He reached into his coat and drew a scroll sealed in red wax. He let it fall open. The parchment crackled like dried skin. Edric looked away. The house of Montrevalt, Tristan read aloud, shall fall into ruin and blood, unless the lost heir, born of flame and darkness, takes the name of the dead and binds her fate to the bloodline before the moon bleeds thrice. He looked up. The third blood moon rises tomorrow. Elisa's voice was cold. And if I don't bind my fate? Then the manor dies, Edric said quietly. The land crumbles. The curse finishes what it started. What curse? Tristan turned away, voice low. The Montrevalts were not just nobles. They were bound to something old. A pact sealed generations ago, knowledge in exchange for blood. Elise laughed, but it broke halfway through. You summoned something. We bargained with something, Tristan corrected. But a Montrevalt broke the pact. The fire was punishment. And now, only a soul who bears the name Eleonora can seal it again. Her mind spun. So you made me her. Trained me, shaped me, lied to me, just to throw me into this curse and call it salvation? Tristan's eyes burned. I gave you purpose. She stepped back, disgust rising like bile. You gave me a lie. Edric stepped between them. She deserves the truth now. All of it. Tristan's voice turned venomous. You've grown soft, boy. Don't forget, she's not your betrothed. She's your sacrifice. The word hit the room like a thunderclap. Elisa's blood went cold. Edric turned slowly, eyes wide. You never said. She is the final seal, Tristan hissed. The prophecy ends in blood. Hers. For a moment, no one moved. Then Elise whispered. Then you should have let me burn. That night, the manor breathed heavier than before. The wind howled not outside, but through the walls, as if the house itself were weeping. Elise locked her chamber door and sat on the cold floor, knees drawn to her chest. Every thought felt like glass grinding through her skull. Her name was a lie. Her life, a cage. Her death, a plan. And Edric, what was he now? She wanted to trust him. She needed to. But the memory of Tristan's voice echoed, "She is your sacrifice." She didn't sleep. At dawn, someone knocked, 3 soft taps. "Elise," Edric said from behind the door. "Let me explain." She hesitated, then opened it. He looked broken. "I didn't know," he said. "Not until last night. My father kept the final verse of the prophecy from me. I thought you were meant to rule. I didn't know they meant to kill you." "Do you believe him?" she asked. He paused, just a beat too long. And Elise, heart still tender with hope, felt it snap. "You do. Elise." She stepped back. "You believed in the prophecy more than in me." He didn't deny it. And that, more than anything, shattered her. Later that day, the household began preparing for the ritual. She wasn't told the details. Only that she was to wear white. Again. Servants dressed her in silk and silver, braided her hair with ash-laced ribbons, painted ancient runes across her wrists. No one met her eyes. She was led to the Chapel of Thorns, a place deep beneath the manor, carved into the bedrock. A shrine of blood and time. Candles burned in a circle. An altar stood at the center, stained and cracked. And beside it, the mirror. Still whole. Still watching. Tristan waited, dressed like a priest of shadows. Edric stood behind him, eyes full of guilt and something else, fear. Elise walked to the center. No one stopped her. She stared at the mirror. It stared back. And then, as silence filled the chamber, her reflection stepped out. Same face. Same body. But this girl was smiling. And then she spoke. "You were never meant to die, Elise. I took your place once. But now, I want it back." The reflection stood inches from her, flesh, not glass. Her twin. Her shadow. Her ghost. She wore the same dress, bore the same face. But her eyes were not blind. They burned. "I was Eleonora," she said. "The real one. I died screaming in that fire while they dragged you away. But something lingered. Memory. Soul. Vengeance." Elisa's voice came out in a whisper. "You're not her." The reflection's smile widened. "I'm what she became, when she burned. When the pact took her in." Tristan stepped forward, awe in his voice. The mirror kept her soul bound. The sacrifice must reunite what was split, to close the curse. One body. One name. He raised a dagger, silver etched with ancient runes. 2 spirits in one vessel. The air must be whole again. Elisa's heart thundered. "You want me to merge with her?" "No," said the reflection. "He wants to kill us both and take what's left." The candlelight flared. Tristan turned sharply, but the mirror girl was faster. She struck him across the chest with a wave of heat that smelled like smoke and roses. He crashed into the wall, choking. "You think I waited all this time to be a puppet?" she snarled. Elise stared, frozen. Edric moved toward her. "We have to leave. Now." But the reflection blocked the path. "She's not going anywhere." And then she turned to Elise, softer now. "You don't know what you are, do you? Why the manor woke when you arrived? Why the blood moons follow you?" Elise shook her head slowly. "You weren't just chosen. You were changed. The fire that killed me passed through you. It marked you. Gave you my gifts. Elise felt something stir under her skin. Heat. Light. Anger. You mean? I can stop this. You can burn it all down, the reflection whispered. Behind them, Tristan stood again, bloodied, furious. You stupid girl. You think power makes you free? You were born to die. That's all you've ever been good for. Elise looked at him, and for the first time, she saw everything. The curse. The lies. The twisted love dressed as duty. The generations of women like her, rewritten and erased. Her hands began to glow. You should have let me be no one, she said. And then the flames came. Not from candles. From her. The chapel of thorns lit up with fire not of this world. Not destruction, transformation. Elise stood in the center, her eyes blind but blazing with light from somewhere deeper. Her skin did not burn. The flames danced around her, clinging like a second skin, a crown of heat and memory. Tristan screamed. He raised the dagger again, but this time, Edric was faster. With a cry of rage and grief, he tackled his father to the ground. The blade skittered across the stone floor, landing at Elisa's feet. She didn't pick it up. She didn't need it anymore. The mirror pulsed behind her. The reflection, Eleonora, stood silent, watching. End it, she said. Elise looked at her. You're not my shadow, she said. You're my beginning. Eleonora stepped forward, her eyes soft now. Then let us be whole. Elise nodded. She reached out her hand. And the moment their fingers touched, there was light. Blinding. Cleansing. A sound like 1,000 voices exhaling at once. The mirror shattered into dust. When Elise opened her eyes, the flames were gone. So was Eleonora. But something had changed. She wasn't just Elise. She wasn't just Eleonora. She was herself, for the first time. Her body trembled, but not from fear. She turned to Edric. He knelt beside Tristan's body, silent. I didn't know it would go this far, he whispered. You didn't stop it, she said. But you tried to change. That matters. A little. She walked past him. Up through the halls of the dying manor. Past the paintings that watched. Past the stones that whispered. As she reached the front steps, the sun broke through the clouds for the first time in weeks. The storm had passed. Behind her, the manor groaned, then cracked. A slow collapse. No screams. No pain. Just an end. Weeks later, travelers passing through the edge of Briar Hollow speak of a woman who lives near the ruins of an old estate. Blind, but unafraid. They say she listens to the wind and sometimes speaks to the dead. Some say she's cursed. Others say she's a witch. But one boy swears he saw her touch a dying tree, and it bloomed. No one remembers her name. But the fire still answers to her.